So today I'm talking with Dr. James Cornelius, who is Secretary of the Abraham Lincoln Association and a longtime Lincoln scholar. Um, and we're asking the same question to everyone. Is 1865, this is the 160th anniversary of all the events that happened in 1865. And Illinois has a strong connection to three of the, I guess, probably the biggest, I would say, the biggest events that happened in 1865. One was the ratification of the 13th Amendment. Um, that happened. Illinois was the first to ratify the 13th Amendment on February 1st, correct?
Mhm.
And then, of course, when General Grant paroled uh, the Confederate Army at Appomattox, when Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia. He paroled the soldiers rather than taking them in as prisoners of war or, hanging a bunch of them with military courts or anything that could have been the alternative. And then, of course, culminating in the, of course, the big, the one that most people, you know, would probably recognize as most is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So with those three big events happening in 1865, the question is with the ability to have that 2020 hindsight, um, which is the biggest in far terms of short-term impact, and then 160 years later, which one has probably had the biggest impact that's affecting us today?
Well, excellent question. Though I don't know that we have 2020 hindsight. I'm not sure that there's such thing. These
Mm-hmm.
are these are hypothetical questions. Um, Counterfactual questions are a subset of hypothetical questions. But so it, that's the way I started thinking about this, Miranda. What
Mm-hmm.
if the House of Representatives had not passed the 13th Amendment, which
Mm-hmm.
the Senate had already passed back in the spring of 1864? Would there have been another effort under the new House
Mm-hmm.
and sworn in after March 4th? And the answer is probably there would have been, and probably it would have passed then. But other things might have changed. You know,
Mm-hmm.
Illinois might still have become the first state to ratify it. In any case, then the second part of that is what would feeling around the country have been in a political sense uh, without a 13th Amendment already passed by Congress and making its way through various states by early April of
Mm-hmm.
1865. If it hadn't, would Grant have needed to be harder on Lee's army, on the Confederate political leadership,
Mm-hmm.
which had already fled, as you know, by about the 3rd or so of, of April, fled
Right.
Richmond. So, and then would Booth even have been in the crowd when Lincoln gave a speech on April 11th, which he might not have given? In fact, he
Mm-hmm.
would not have given had Lee been arrested, say, rather than paroled.
Right.
Well, so I'm not trying to change your question altogether, but those are some of the issues.
Mm-hmm.
Counterfactuals are hard to sort out. I think in general, Illinois can be pretty proud. It
Mm-hmm.
goes without saying for the celerity, the expeditiousness, the speed with which its legislature um, ratified the 13th Amendment.
Yeah, weren't they like right there at midnight? Like right as soon as like it
Yeah,
passed, Lincoln signed
yeah.
it, and then they were just right there.
The governor knew it was going, and the telegraph lines between the White House and the governor's mansion, not literally, but in between,
Hmm.
in a manner of speaking, were all set up. Illinois wanted to be first, and they were first, so they
Hmm.
got the news right away. that the House of Representatives had passed the vote on by 2 votes, nearly failed. We know that from the Steven Spielberg film about Lincoln, that they could immediately call themselves to order in a very early hour of
Mm-hmm.
February 1st and vote. And it was not a unanimous vote, but it was very heavily in
Yeah.
favor. Yeah. So then the next question arising from that, kind of on the side, is about the black laws,
Mm-hmm.
which were not universal across the North or even the South in their itemization, but were unpleasant enough,
Mm-hmm.
obstructive enough in Illinois that they had to be dealt with right away. And John Jones, as a lot of people know, just recently is the man who gets the credit. He's an African American tailor and political organizer in Chicago who
Mm-hmm.
led the movement to immediately get Illinois to rescind the black laws. And that
Mm-hmm.
happened in the spring. I think it was June. I may have the date wrong, 65.
Mm-hmm.
The city council may not have been sitting for a while. And then you get up to those more momentous questions you've asked. Um, if Grant had seen fit, then he wouldn't have done this on his own initiative. He was taking Lincoln's direction to let him up easy. That
Mm-hmm.
was Lincoln's phrase more than once. Um, but if something had gone wrong, if there had been a soldier in Grant's army of a mindset like Boston Corbett, who shot Booth in the barn at the Garrett Farm in
Mm-hmm.
Virginia on April 26th, and taken it upon himself to shoot Robert E. Lee right there, and never mind the halls of justice, and never mind the political hierarchy or the ramifications. Um, it would have been a terrible thing.
Oh yeah. I can't imagine what the South's response would have been. That
Yeah. But turn it around. What if Booth had only wounded Lincoln
mm-hmm.
in the box at Ford's Theater? This gets to the bigger question. And we've seen something like it pretty recently. Donald Trump was merely
Mm-hmm.
wounded by an assassin in Butler, Pennsylvania, late last year.
Mm-hmm.
This did good things in the political polls for Donald Trump and the Republicans. I think it likely would have had the same effect in the United States in 1865
Mm-hmm.
if Lincoln had only been wounded, except the knowledge we'd have of whether the Confederate cabinet were involved in Booth's plot. And I've never been a supporter of the notion that they were involved, really,
Mm-hmm.
but we'll never know. We would have found out more if
Yeah.
Booth had been apprehended. But what would people in the North have felt about slavery? What would people in the South have felt if a madman, apparently working on his own inclinations,
Mm-hmm.
had tried to assassinate President Lincoln when the war was at 99% over?
Mm-hmm.
I think there would have been much more sympathy for the wounded Lincoln
Mm-hmm.
in the South than we ended up seeing.
I had I posed a question to just a friend of mine talking about it, and they wondered if the sentiment, especially with, and you had mentioned with Donald Trump, if it wouldn't have been maybe similar to the January 6th insurrection, and then with Donald Trump's assassination attempt, if that wouldn't have been more like what the Confederate Army would have been like um, if Grant hadn't paroled the soldiers, but had been tried. They had been tried and convicted in military tribunals.
Yeah, that there would have been a lot of anger.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think Confederate soldiers would have got very close to the U.S. Capitol or
Hmm.
any courthouse where Lee, for example, was on, or Jefferson Davis was on trial.
Hmm.
Uh, I think that military security would have been much more heightened around Washington.
Hmm.
Um, but again, these are counterfactuals. And remember,
Yeah.
if Grant, you and I have spoken about this, if Grant had gone to the theater
Hmm.
with the Lincolns, Ulysses and Julia, been sitting there, Booth never would have got into the box because Grant would have had a bodyguard out in the
Right.
hallway,
Hmm.
where Lincoln had only a part-time Washington, D.C. policeman of dubious political loyalty.
Hmm.
It wasn't his job anyway to be a bodyguard to the president. There was no such person other than Ward Hill Lamon, who had
Hmm.
gone to Richmond the day before on Lincoln's orders. So, yeah, I think that the feeling, this, your question, your observation leads to the larger point about the lost cause
Hmm.
in the South. Would it have grown up? Would, and I think it probably would have grown either way. No matter what happened to Lee at Appomattox, no matter what happened to Lincoln at Ford's Theater,
Hmm.
it was still, if you, some of your listeners might know about the end of World War One in Europe, that Germans never exactly surrendered. Well, some did and some didn't.
Hmm.
And others were trying to start what was essentially a Bolshevik revolution with some assistance from Russia. And what term came to be used there was the stab in the back.
Hmm.
That the German people had been stabbed in the back by a few unauthorized, cowardly leaders, and that they hadn't really lost the war. And that was the feeling all through the 20s, and it gave rise to Hitler's party and a movement of socialism of a nationalist sort, as distinct from an internationalist sort
Hmm.
allied with the Soviets. So there's the stab in the back that could have been felt by Southern Confederate diehards, call them fire eaters again, as
Hmm.
in 1960 or 61, who would not have given up is a pretty substantial number.
Oh yeah.
But but how many of the same opinion existed in the North? How many John Browns were
Hmm.
there in the Northern Army or the Northern populace who would not have stopped at a military trial for 2 or 17 Southerners,
Hmm.
who would have gone and taken vengeance themselves against slave owners in Kentucky, Maryland, or Virginia. These are things we don't know, but in that sense, the murder of Lincoln did put a capstone on a great deal of
Hmm.
it ended the argument.
So I guess as far as looking at each event and their impact of what did happen and their impact today,
Yeah,
which one, if you had to pick one, which one would you say that is actively impacting us still today?
yeah, that's that's the end point of my long preface, isn't it?
Yes.
Um, I think I think you could say that the 13th Amendment
Hmm.
is probably the most impactful because it did lead pretty quickly to the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Hmm.
There is a statistic about this out there. Of all the societies that have had slavery through, as far as we know, hundreds of years of recorded and thousands of years of unrecorded history, slaves who were freed and then got to the point of citizenship involving the right to vote took generations in some places
Hmm.
and one generation in other places. And in the United States, it took 7 years.
Hmm.
There's nowhere that's really close to that. That from 1865 until 1872, with some local elections after the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution in
Hmm.
1771, when it went into effect, there were black men voting in not all, but many places in the US,
Hmm.
uh, some of whom had been enslaved as of 1865. So that was a remarkably rapid change of social arrangements, unprecedented, and to my knowledge, not repeated since in the Spanish or the Portuguese, Brazilian examples.
Hmm.
So that's why I'd say the 13th Amendment, I think, is the most impactful. Um, if just to try to put them into rank order, well, the murder of Lincoln is one thing, and the non-murder of Robert E. Lee is another completely. I'm not sure what to say about that. Probably if Lee had been imprisoned, first of all, his family letters might have come out
Hmm.
a whole lot earlier than they did under Elizabeth Brown Pryor's book uh, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when it
Hmm.
turns out old good Massa Lee was whipping his slaves like every other slave,
Hmm.
breaking up families. Not all the time, but he was no different really from any other cruel Southern slave owner.
Hmm.
And his reputation might not have gone very far into the heavens. I think he
Yeah,
never
he's
would have
kind of really up
become
there next to Lincoln up in that marble statue.
yeah,
Can't be touched, kind of,
yeah.
you know.
He wouldn't have become a college president, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
So,
So, and what about Andrew Johnson as a president? Well, certainly our second worst, I guess, after James Buchanan, and least qualified, bar none, to be president. But he did represent a majority of opinion.
hmm. Yeah, I asked, I think it was my sister the other day. I said, "Do you know who Hamlin is?" And she said, "Who's that?" And I said, "He was Lincoln's vice president the first term." And she's like, "Oh my gosh, I've never heard that." And I said, "Can you imagine if Lincoln had been assassinated with Hamlin as the VP? What would that presidency have looked like?"
Yeah, not all that bad, probably. I mean, he was an ex-Democrat
Hmm.
and he was anti-slavery. It's exactly why he was chosen vice president. And he had the respect of most of the Senate with whom he had served,
Hmm.
whereas Andrew Johnson's level of respect as a person and a politician was not terribly high.
Just that little twist of fate. We
Mm-hmm.
got we got Andrew Johnson instead of Hamlin instead.
Yeah.
Just Crazy how history works, doesn't it?
It is crazy, yes. And well, and what if Andrew Johnson had been killed on April 15th, as was the plan? George Atzerodt
Hmm.
chickened out, left and got drunk.
Yeah.
And I believe that means, well, I've forgotten this because it's changed twice since then. The next person in line to become president was the Secretary of State, William Seward,
William
who
Seward.
was um, almost killed.
Hmm.
After him, I think it might be Edwin Stanton, and I'm not sure about that. There was a senator from Connecticut whose name was Lafayette something, Lafayette Foster, who not a name known to anybody really. He was very close to the succession.
Hmm.
Uh, so yeah, we have an amazing system which is self-correcting in a way. It's got a lot of checks and balances.
Hmm.
Remember, Salmon P. Chase was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. As hard an anti-slavery man has existed in the nation, and I think that the Northern cause would have been protected from his side
Hmm.
pretty strong. And but yeah, if Roger Taney hadn't died when he did, June of '64, well, then he would have been in charge.
Yeah. So, alrighty. Well, thank you so much for talking to us about this, and hopefully, everybody will learn a little bit more about 1865 and all the craziness of that year,
Yes.
and we can apply it to this year and apply
But
it
we
to
don't
our,
know that. We don't know that yet. This year's not over. But yes, it's 160th anniversary, a good round number.
yes, 160th anniversary of 1865.
All right.
So thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Miranda. Bye bye.